It was
Infernalism, right?
oh yeah. So it was the last of the Pope Francis generation podcast
That's
where
right.
you kind of gave your story,
Hmm.
and I keyed in when you mentioned hell a few times and the role that that kind of played in your journey. And so then I just shot you an email. I found your website. Well, you had mentioned it, and I sent you
Hmm.
that little essay that I had written about hell. So I think that's kind of, and then we went from email exchanges from there. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And I liked how you had gone through it. So I won't lie, I was deliberately using those words, curious to see if anybody sort of sat up. So the conversation, what we're sort of walking around or talking about is universalism, not in the sense that we want to defend it, like I just said offline, or not that we want to defend it or articulate it or build a case for it, but more the fact that we both found ourselves in it and just recognizing there is an undeniable truth or reality to it. And we've been on journeys that kind of ended up there. And I was just curious, as you wrote this article, you sort of recapping Balthasar. I think it's Balthasar's name.
Yeah.
No, what's the name? That all shall be saved. Isn't that his name? Or dare we hope?
Yeah. Well,
Dare we
so
hope.
David Bentley Hart, but also Balthasar. That we could get into that too. But he played
Yeah,
a
yeah.
role in my journey as well. Yeah.
Awesome. So both for me as well.
Yeah.
And so what I thought is, hey, let's just come on the channel. This is my personal channel, and let's just chat about what has been the experience that the stories that have maybe led us to this, and then what were the objections, and maybe what kind of tipped us over the edge, and kind of where are we now? I'm just really curious, to sort of hear that. So, if I may, why don't we just start with you, John? So how long have you been a Universalist?
Yeah, good question. So I think I've been a hopeful universalist. In other words, the idea that we can hope that all will be saved. We can't know for sure. All will
Mhm.
be saved in Christ, obviously. A Christian universalist.
Yeah.
For about 5 or 6 years, probably, and then I've been kind of a confident or hard universalist. I don't like the hard terminology, but
Yeah.
confident universalist, probably for about 2 or 3 years now, where I
Okay.
kind of finally went over the edge and said, not only can we hope, but
Hmm.
we can know, we can be confident. So
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah, so not real long. I'm
Okay.
still kind of figuring out how all the connections that kind of come and flow from
Right.
this.
Right. I agree. Yeah. It's about the same for me. It's been a couple of years. Finding or discovering Jordan Daniel Wood actually was the final nail in the coffin. And so, yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about the difference between soft universalism and hard universalism, and I cannot understand this concept of like soft universalism. It's like it's either is or it isn't. Like you're either it's I don't know. I'm with Bentley Hart on this in that
Yeah,
we are all too polite about specific topics such as hell, and we walk around it, and like it's the dignified thing is to not talk about this very embarrassing theological situation we find
right,
ourselves in, and it's
right.
like it either all is or isn't, and I've reread his book through twice, and I reread that all shall be saved, or no, dare we hope. I keep confusing them,
There we go. Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
we ought to hope, or something as it was published. Reread through that twice, and I'm like, how can this seems so obviously the Christian message, but ended up being just stuck on quite literally the concept of hell and what that then meant for human freedom. What that Bentley Hart is hard to sort of digest.
But yeah, I agree.
What?
Real quick, I
Yeah.
agree on that distinction being a hard one to maintain. And I think Hart gives the I think the philosophical and logical reasons why that distinction is difficult, but I think also just psychologically, like
Mhm.
and like that you talked about, kind of how this fleshes out in our lived faith lives and as of our families. I feel like the hopeful universalist position doesn't really end up giving a whole lot of hope because there's still the possibility that like as you live your life, like
Mhm.
this is a possibility, right? The idea
Mhm.
that God could actually end up being this way. Um,
Mhm.
which I think psychologically doesn't actually give you a whole lot of hope. It doesn't, at least in my experience, doesn't actually make much of a difference relative to just kind of the infernalist position on a day to day. You kind of almost have to go the whole way for it to actually make a difference in your actual conception of God and your lived relationship with God at a practical level. That's in my experience at least.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. It's not a satisfying position. And I mean, I haven't yet talked with a hopeful universalist, and I should, maybe have a look at some of their articles. Or I mean, I sort of have, but the more I've dug into them, the more it doesn't. It just keeps building a stronger case to me about how compelling just universalism without labels. It's kind of like Catholicism, like without labels. We keep trying to add these labels to it. And I find every time you do that, it becomes an ism. It just becomes another ideology. Whereas the goal of trying to be Catholic, right, is trying to come into full, unfiltered contact with reality itself. And it takes a lot of silence and a lot of contemplation and a lot of engagement with that. And if I find universalism is one of those pieces that, like, the more contact you have with reality and with trying to understand the human condition, I don't know. I like something you mentioned in an email where you said this is like the defining, maybe theological issue of our age. And I thought, okay, that rings true for me. Why do you think that? Why did you word it that way?
Yeah, we're both fans of the Regeneration podcast and those guys on there, and I think they're kind of getting they're putting their finger on kind of this sort of epochal change that we're kind of going through. And there's, we don't have to get into it all, but I think that there is these sort of seismic shifts, and I think a big one of them is this notion of the development of the understanding of dignity and conscience. And you can look at within the church, you can look at the evolving nature of the church's understanding on the death penalty, on religious freedom in Vatican II, right? Where sort of the way that the church couches our understanding, our development on these things, certainly the church's teaching has substantially developed on these issues, is sort of as we come to know human dignity more and understand the fullness of this doctrine revealed in Christ of human dignity. And I think also if you can look at the world sort of in its sort of rejection of Christian faith. If you look at the whole unfolding of modernity into secularism and all the sort of, we're kind of nearing the end of this sort of age, potentially maybe, and why the world, so to speak, has kind of turned its back on the Christian faith. I think we can actually learn something from that too. And I think ironically, in certain ways, that and I'm using these big terms, but in the world, in the world's sort of rejection of Christendom and rejection of the gospel, in a sense, I think ironically, in that rejection, the world has managed to preserve something that is essential to the gospel that ironically the church itself has kind of forgotten, or at least not completely
How
remembered.
funny. Oh, what a
And I
great
think
little,
that's this idea of dignity, right? And this idea of conscience. And I think, and so I think that's related to universalism, because like I'm super skeptical of we've had we had John Paul II and the new evangelization. We had all and I'm very much in favor of sort of how do we evangelize in this sort of post-Christian era. There's lots of interesting conversations to be had there, but I really don't think there's going to be much success or traction in getting us into this next age of Christianity, whatever that looks like, until this issue of infernalism or universalism, to cast it in the positive light, is addressed. Because I really think that even if it's not explicit, a lot of the rejection of the Christian faith is stemming from this notion that people just no longer find it believable that a good God, a God that we're supposed to be understanding as Father, his children to everlasting torment, and that's just not believable anymore. And I think rightly so, right? And I think the church has to really deal with this this question before we can really expect to sort of win those people back, to put it in a kind of a crude terminology. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think you're right, and I it makes sense to me. I'm so intrigued by that what you said there about the maybe we'll call them the holy faithful people of God, or maybe just the general sort of consciousness of humanity has anchored down on something, or has rejected the articulation of a truth because it does not map onto the deep felt intuition of, well, let's say the Holy Spirit at work in the human soul across, just corporate humanity, the human family. That reminds me of that the story of Regeneration podcast refers to Sophia a lot, and the sense that the woman, what was it, was cast out into the desert, away from the garden, right? And if we see the garden as the church, to have truth, or to, cast out into the desert. And if we say all of the people who are outside the garden are those in the desert, and that's where she's nurtured and safeguarded from the dragon,
Yeah.
it it rings true, and it's just interesting, for those who trying to think what I was reading. I can't remember, but we've got this distinction that I'm routinely forcing, trying to make between the hierarchical, and maybe this is the wrong word, but the magisterial church versus the church in time, right, or the church outside of time, the eternal church, ecclesia herself, where she instantiates in time through the persons of her ministers, and the Pope and the prelates who make her up, and then mediate what she is, and incorporate all of us. And I'm probably making a theologian pull his hair out with this, but
No,
the fact that the
track.
human side gets it so badly wrong, so often, or we got our own, hang-ups and stuff, and this thing about, I want to ask you about your story, how you first discovered universalism, because it just took me ages to get over the fact that catechism seems blindingly obvious with what it says. And it seems church history is so, anchored down on what happens, right after death, and what hell is and what it means, and all of the visions of the mystics and stuff. And I don't know about you, I grew up with Fatima constantly. That was, I think I've shared this story before, but I just think it's such a funny little kind of metric for this whole conversation. There was this Fatima group that reached out to me and said, "Hey, we'd like you to come do some marketing for us," And so I said, "Well, okay, that's great. Let's start with a consult, and here's my fee, and let's just meet and talk, and I'll look at your website, give you a couple of suggestions, see if we want to go forward from there." And so we met, and my number one recommendation was, okay, you're asking a millennial to advise you on your marketing campaign because you want to reconnect with young people. That's what you said. Okay, my number one recommendation, back off on the hell stuff. Okay, and lead with all of the rest of Mary's visions, which are so beautiful, and hopeful, and empowering, and trying to, blah, 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 do the human thriving, Christ in humanity, all of the good stuff that, like most of us have no idea is in there. Instead, we all have the one vision of, hellfire. And I could see like the infernalist shutdown that clouds their faces, and they never called me back, and I didn't do any more work for them. But it just struck me as this is hilarious. People who are, I can't think of a more universalist prayer than the prayer of Our Lady of Fatima, right? It's so beautiful and it's so simple. And that's the thing. Universalists don't deny the reality of hell. We just challenge its function.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's such a major difference that a lot of people who are wandering around universalism just don't get. There's such a lot of straw men. I'm just curious, how did you first hear about universalism, and what were some of your initial thoughts about it, if you remember?
Yeah. It's one of those things where I was in preparation of this conversation, I was trying to like go back and think of, and it's hard to put, to identify like the very first thread, but
Yeah.
I know one of the beginning threads. Well, it's kind of this combination, both experiential and then, it was, and I think we have a similar experience here, if I remember correctly, that it wasn't really until I became a father that I even kind of thought about this. Really, I mean, I was actually raised as an evangelical Protestant, then I converted after grad school to the Catholic Church.
Oh, wow,
Now I'm
really?
visiting Catholic. Yeah, and
Okay.
that is not super relevant. I mean, there are a couple tangentially relevant things, but again, through that whole journey, starting in Protestantism and into Roman Catholicism, up until probably my late 20s, early 30s, it hadn't even really uh, occurred to me to find an issue with this doctrine. I just kind of accepted it. Not in any kind of troubled way. But it wasn't until kind of my oldest my boy. He's probably around 3, that you just start to, it just starts to soak in, like, as you relate to your
Yeah.
child as a father, and you think, Jesus explicitly instructs us in the Gospels to think of our Heavenly Father in the same, using the same analogies, like the way that we relate to our earthly fathers to relate to the Heavenly Father. He instructs us to use that analogy, so I did implicitly, not consciously, and you just start to realize, like, wait a second, like, I know the kind of love that I have for my
Uh-huh.
son or my children, and I'm this imperfect, fallen, like, I know all of my faults. How could God the Father ever, that kind of, that argument, how could God the Father ever consign his children to everlasting hell. So that was kind of the
Yeah.
backdrop as just the reality of being a father started to kind of sink in into
Hmm.
the core of my beliefs, kind of only almost subconsciously. And then I
Hmm.
think pretty early on, I came across von Balthasar's book, The Dare We Hope, and I think that's really what broke it open as like, oh, this is actually a position. Not only is it a position, they had
Hmm.
and that's the hopeful universalist, but
Hmm.
even that to me was a breath of fresh air. The idea that at least I can hope, right? But even I think one of the most interesting parts of that book is when he goes through the liturgy, the mass and the liturgy of the hours, and it's like we are as a church we're already praying for this, right? We already
Hmm.
pray that all will be saved. You mentioned the Fatima prayer. There's lots of examples, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so I'm already praying for this. So if I'm praying for it, then at least it should be possible, right?
Hmm.
And hope for it. And that's really got me. That's what got me started. I mean, there's more steps along the way, but I think that kind of experience of fatherhood plus being exposed to Balthasar's book, uh, and the fact that this is actually a possibility, right? Like I
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
actually hope for this. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And for you, like if I remember, am I right that um, remind me again how it started with you and your
Yeah, I'm
your
actually trying to like go back and remember like what was the path, like having disciplining my child one day when she was having a real meltdown, and I remember threatening something and then starting to carry out that threat and then realized I can't actually finish my threat. This whole situation is wrong in that my threat was trying to like scare her straight, and
Mhm.
I can't actually deliver on this. And it instantly laddered up to like she's a child and she has no idea what she's doing. And then if I ladder this up to myself in light of God being an infinite, omniscient being, and I know I've got addictions and I've got bad habits and I'm carrying around, you know, um, what do you call them? Psychic ghosts or patterns or epigenetic, patterns and habits of stuff that I never wanted and I was just born with, and I have a deck of cards that I didn't ask for and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, it's like punishing, a child with a club foot for not being able to finish a marathon. It's like there's parts of this stuff that are just straight up not your fault, and
Yeah.
that require that understanding of an all loving, omniscient parent. And I remember just thinking, well, if I can feel that for her, how could I be more humane than God? This doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to like ladder back and think like, what was my initial exposure to this? Because I remember it being dismissed as such a silly thing because hell is enshrined with such great sacred, religious rites, right up next to the altar. And it's like, there's a point now where it's like almost so ridiculous how we feel about this. Have you ever seen the trailer for, or the game cinematics for Diablo 4?
I don't think so.
No?
I've heard
Okay.
of the game, but I don't think I've seen the trailer.
Yeah, I've never played the games, but I saw the latest trailer because it looked like so fascinating and well done. It kept showing up on Instagram and stuff. So I went and watched it. And it's like, for those who have seen it or who know it, it's like this sense of a heavenly angelic army, airdropping into the realms of hell, and then with shield and a holy spear, taking down legions of orcs and slamming their way into the deeper recesses, and everything is such horrible pain and self righteousness, and it's so weird and ugly because we're talking about ultimate existential stuff, and yet it's being dramatized in a fantasy sort of thing. And you sort of wonder, well, what happens when these things die? Like, where did they go for being bad? And it's like you end up being like turtles all the way down. It's like hell all the way down. I'm like, this is okay. This is actually kind of silly because unfortunately, what we're looking at, and I know it's a fantasy game, that's kind of like Catholic fantasy. We're using Catholic mythology, but that's actually kind of the problem. That is the mythology that's in our minds when we go to read things like the Catechism or visions from heaven or from the saints and so on. This mythology, it's a very kind of neo Viking, sort of thing. I mean, right there, that's the problem. We're reading into the sacred words, the sacred scriptures, and the liturgy, our own imaginary experience of how we're trying to navigate social contracts, problems in life, and stuff. So that was a side quest.
Yeah, I think you're
But
totally right. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. That the imaginary that as much as we might not like to admit it, like that
Hmm.
kind of, like that example of the video game is not too far from some of the imaginary the imagination that we have kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
developed in the West. I mean, just like looking at Dante's Inferno,
Hmm.
or I was in Rome recently. We had a chance to go with my family, and I went to one of the churches, and you have this huge, massive mural artwork, and the top half is heaven, and the bottom half is hell, and it's pretty grotesque, right? And this
Hmm.
is a chapel that I had a friend who's in a religious order, and he would pray regularly every day in this chapel. Right, you're
Hmm.
absorbing those kind of images of this
Hmm.
torment, and
Yeah.
like it's an uncomfortable fact that that's kind of in many ways how our
Hmm.
imaginations and our spiritual life has been formed, with these images, like you said,
Yeah.
are not actually in Scripture, at least, maybe in the Book of Revelation, but like we shouldn't, whatever,
It's kind of like if you were to imagine, which is kind of how I think about it now. How do I say this? What's a way to say this? If you imagine our spiritual life as like a circle or something, if you cut a segment off of it and you bifurcate it, going up is like good and going down is like bad. And I'm not sure where I'm going with that metaphor, but it's like looking at that painting, you've bifurcated between up and down.
Yeah,
You're trying to communicate a theological reality, which is within your given life, it has I don't know if it's accurate to say, but it's like your life has infinite capacity for you to level up or to engrail and become more Christ-like within your given life. You can break the chains, you can change everything, or you could also like lose everything. And I can understand why theologically the church holds up that vision, because the moment you take away the value of every single individual life, you then get stuck in these infinite cycles of meaningless seeming or ongoing infinite agony of things like the unending reincarnation cycles, right? The problem, though, with the church kind of going hard into every single life matters is that you then lose the sense of, well, these theological imaginative things that we're trying to make sense of all out of all these mystic visions, they're incomplete when you then flatten them into an icon like that. Gosh, what a conversation. I don't know where to stop. Let's just sort of walk it back a little bit,
yeah,
because
yeah, yeah,
it's a good point, because you're right. So where I'm trying to go with that was like the imaginative content that you bring to these revealed sort of spiritual truths can help or hinder, right?
yeah,
Often both. I've got this. I'm fascinated by this concept, right? We know that the church. How do I say this? Within the context of the church's spiritual disciplines, the concept of science was born as a discipline. And what struck me as just fascinating is the idea that the church started this scientific discipline centuries back when she started looking at all of these mystic visions of the mystics and realizing the problem with mystics running the show is that none of them are guaranteed to have interpreted their visions correctly. So we need to get scientific about all of this mysticism. And so they created the magisterium to kind of weigh all of the visions in the balance, and what shakes out is like bedrock truth.
yeah,
But the thing that, again, this sort of goes back to like, you also have to be careful with that, because this is something, for example, we see it today with like psychedelics and entheogens. The mentality and the mythology that you bring into this experiential state defines how you experience and what you see, either what you attract to you or how you interpret things.
yeah,
I think that rule of thumb is true, for example, of mystic visions. I remember once someone describing, I had a vision of purgatory. Like, how many visions of purgatory are basically souls burning in hell light, right? And then there was this one vision where it's like, I saw all these people walking around in like a gray fog or a gray mist. And I thought, that's weird and interesting. But from a symbolic standpoint, that's actually really interesting, because if you like symbolically equate water to truth, and then you have broken, I can't remember, it made sense when I thought about it years back. Basically, if you interpret everything in terms of symbol, what does the symbol of mean spiritually compared to the symbol of water?
mm,
And then what does the symbol of fire mean? And that's kind of what started to throw me when I realized wait a second, why do we take all of the Fatima visions as symbolic except for the hell one? That's very
Right.
conveniently literal. And the
Yeah.
moment I realized that, it's like, wait a second, I don't know how to think about this. And so right around this time, I'm listening to the Regeneration podcast. I don't think I was like Universalist yet at that point. I had gone off the deep end and read Heart, and I don't remember why it came up, probably because it was such a compelling book title. I think that I had burned through Dare We Hope by Balthasar, and I didn't know what to make of it, and I wanted it so badly. And so that's a soft universalism. I thought, after reading it, this is the Catholic thing. I couldn't believe, I feel like I finally found the gospel. And then I found Bentley Hart, and I'm like, crap, now what? Go
Now
back
what do
and
I do?
reread the first one, And now I'm like, so like Jordan Daniel Wood, he's kind of like the sort of clincher for me. But at the same time, I was also reading Valentin Tomberg and Rudolf Steiner and trying to, of course, Regeneration podcast was getting me into all of that stuff. And it's starting to build a whole different vision of how creation is constituted, how Christ engages with it, why all of these sort of pieces start to matter. This has been a 5-year crusade journey thing. But that point right there about how we imagine the afterlife pieces working, and that's when I realized after watching like this Diablo 4 thing, because there are these accounts like on YouTube or Instagram that'll have like Deus Vult, stuff, and these crusading LARPer accounts will be like, they're so fundamentally depressed and angry and moody, and they're sharing all of these angry Templar knights trying to kill everything because manliness. And they love bringing back snippets of these in-game cinematics from Diablo 4, like look at Saint Michael crash landing in hell and like
Yeah.
nuking, a billion demons at once and stuff. I remember thinking, you know what? If this is your imaginative vision of how the afterlife works, that's the problem. Our iconography is all wrong. Because what is a game but like immersing yourself in living iconography? And if this is what people are praying and thinking about, no wonder we have such a hard time. And I remember, I want to turn it back over to you, see what you think. I was listening to Father Richard Rohr, whom I have loved or grown to love more and more deeply over the last 10 years. And somebody once asked him, because I think he's just quietly universalist about the whole thing. And somebody asked him, this podcast episode about hell. And he's like, well, how do you square that, right? Because they're obviously coming from the more normative infernalist standpoint. And he sort of leans back and chuckles and he goes, it's something we kind of invented, and I don't really worry about it. Wait, what? How do you do that? And then I go back to catechism. What does the catechism say, right? Bum, bum, bum. I don't know what to make sense. And then finally, Jordan Daniel Wood stands up and goes, very, very simply, there's one line in one of his YouTube conversations, and he goes, the authoritative weight of what's in the catechism relies on the individual who makes the statement. And the church has coalesced these things I'm going to probably word this wrong, as a normative and sure guide that's the best of what we got based on all the best of what we have. But it is the best of what we have. And as kind of the whole universalist undercurrent in the life of the church, we're recognizing that there is a missed theological series of connections that have sort of derailed us into this infernalism thing, maybe with its good intentions, obviously, but
Yeah.
we've missed certain aspects of the gospel. Let me just stop there because that was a bunch. What do you think?
No,
What's going on?
I complete a couple thoughts. One, you mentioned Jordan Daniel Wood. He's been influential on me too. And getting to, I think you said a minute ago, just the idea of like, or you implied at least, the idea that how we have our vision of the eschaton and how all this all shakes out in the end, can't help but mirror back and be connected to so many other central questions. And one example of that in my experience with Wood was, because he wrote that book on Maximus as his dissertation. But this idea that like in Maximus, creation is incarnation, and even taking it the next step, creation is incarnation is theosis, right? It's all in the sense the same
Wow. Mm-hmm.
reality. It's all the same becoming or exit from God and return to God. So then, if theosis, if you think of theosis in a universalistic key, right, where theosis is
Mm-hmm.
not just all humans, but all
Right.
rational creation, all of creation itself,
Yeah.
participating in God. So if that's the way it ends, then that informs our understanding of, well, incarnation too. Like, what does it look like for Christ to have become a man, to a human? And that this connects to something we started out this conversation in talking about. Like, well, we can look at the whole human family as Christ, and so then we can learn Christ's revelation is in some way present in the whole human family, right? Not just exclusively understood exclusively through the magisterium, although there's a role that the
Right.
magisterium plays there.
Right.
And the same thing with creation itself, right? So anyway, yeah, I feel like those Wood has been really good for me on that, as well as sort of connecting up. If you think of theosis in Universalist register, then all of the implications of
Agreed.
that in our lived life as well. And,
Mhm.
one of my favorite lines in our email exchange was when you said that if once we, hope you don't mind me quoting you,
Oh, sure. I'm brilliant this way, and I've totally forgot. Go ahead.
but kind of once you said once we make universalism axiomatic, right? The idea that, like, this isn't, and that's good, and I wonder if it's the same for you. I came to universalism as kind of almost this remote conclusion that, like, I hope it's true. Like, dare we hope, right? Like, literally the title, which I think
Yeah.
is actually, as a quick aside, I think that title in Balthasar's book is actually more of an existential question than we really admit it. Like, I think ultimately Balthasar, from what I hear, was probably a
Yeah.
universalist, but he didn't feel like a hard universalist, but he didn't feel free
Well, my
to say
understanding is that
that.
that title is not actually his original title. His
Oh,
was
interesting.
something
Okay.
like "We Dare to Hope" or something, and
Oh,
then they
dear.
went to
Okay.
publish it, and the publisher was like, "Eh, we're a Catholic publisher," and so they softened
Uh,
it or something. But I don't quote me, but
Interesting.
that's
Yeah.
what I think I've learned.
Yeah. That's an interesting that's interesting tidbit then. Like, what, but yeah. So this idea that can't so once so I was saying, like, if I came to universalism as almost this dare, like, oh, I hope I can do this, I hope it's okay, then over time, you find it rewinding, it almost becomes the axiom. It's like everything else flows from this, like
Hmm.
in the epistemic tree or whatever,
Hmm.
it can kind of comes farther and farther and farther down to the trunk and to the
Yeah.
base. And then that's where it becomes, I think, for me, and I think for you probably too, exhilarating, right? It's like, well, wow, okay, like, what else is true now, right? If universalism is
Right.
true, what does that mean for practical living of our life, and of our faith life with our family and our parish, and like all these practical questions really become, on the one hand, unsettling. And we can maybe get to this later on the sort of practical implications. I'd be curious your take on this. What are like, for example, what parish do you go to, or how do you deal with homilies with your children,
I
and like
know
all of that? Like, there are all these practical
everything. Yeah.
questions, but it's exhilarating, I think, ultimately, once you make it, in your words, kind of axiomatic. Once you make it a
Hmm.
starting point, not an ending point, I guess.
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah. It's such a if it's the ruling vision. I think that Jordan Daniel Wood has also remained pretty clear. And this is fascinating to me, and this is a little bit unnerving. The more you get into the sort of academic side of how do I say this? Our faith is articulated, and you begin to realize stuff is a lot less dogmatic than we think it is. And so he makes, I think, the point that universalism is a compelling ruling vision of how to read the Gospels. But he's like, you can also read them from an infernalist standpoint, and you will find the quotes that prove it. So then the question then becomes, well, which one is the right one, or under which aspect or something? And okay, I don't know what to do with that. So
Mm-hmm.
he also said, I was listening to his episodes on plowshares, which is on Spotify. He's given like a series of online courses or something, Forging Plowshares, I think it's called. And he said something like, it's like he does this, and what's his name? Bentley Hart will do this. Well, they'll throw out these little thoughts from like way out of left field. Like, wait, you can't just do that. You have to come back and unpack this stuff. Anyhow, and he says something like, not all of the gospel authors were all completely unified in their understanding of, like, I don't know how to say this, every single little point. And I thought, that is really interesting. That actually creates a very compelling reason, first of all, why there are maybe some theological differences between the Gospels and the Acts or something. And I have no qualifications to identify what they are. But this might make sense why, non-Christian scholars go, well, look at this. There's obvious like discrepancies or whatever. Okay, this is
Sure.
actually really interesting if each one of them intuited or learned or had, this clarity, this inspired vision. But then, as we know with any mystic, you read into the vision what you can understand and how you can instantiate it or embody it within what you understand of the world. And that's why you need something like a magisterium to kind of do the sifting, sorting work. The magisterium having the ruling vision to determine how do we read all of this stuff. And I think we've become very comfortable with like packaging and factory shipping sacred scripture out to everybody, and of course, go ahead and read it, and then to start to wind back and realize you still need a paradigm for how to understand all of this. It is not necessarily self-evident. There's a lot of very close connectivity, of course, between the Gospels, but there's pieces that don't all fit as neatly as you would like for it to be a manual for how to win friends and influence people. So if that's the case, oh my gosh, do we need a magisterium? But then the question is, well, how do you know the ruling vision? And I think that's where Jordan has he's nailed it. Okay, so he's nailed it. The church has also sort of gifted this to us. I think a lot of our academics and our scholasticism has lost the central concept of the incarnation. This is what's fascinated me with, what was the name of this guy? I don't remember his name. He's a Franciscan. I don't remember where he is. Franciscan priest. Anyhow, he wrote a book about like forays or gestures towards a new philosophy or a new theology. Anyhow, his essential point is that, like Father Sergei Bulgakov, that we have been anchored, like a lot of Thomism is anchored for too long in the genius of Aristotle and Plato and what they've had to offer. But we now have a new starting point, which is the incarnate Christ. And we need a theology and a philosophy that begins from that metaphysical starting point. I think Duns Scotus was kind of that mystical pioneer for that mindset. It still hasn't really taken root in all of its implications. And I like how you brought that up when you were talking. So what rivets me now with Jordan's insistence on the incarnation as the point of everything, I think he said this at some point, but such that the whole, if the incarnation, since the incarnation is the point of everything, Christ becoming man was not an accidental thing. It was the intention of God to become that which he loves. So the Big Bang was not the beginning of the universe. The incarnation was the actual beginning of the universe. Everything else is the prelude. Everything else is like is setting the stage, is clarifying the consciousness, is the human embodying towards creating or towards becoming, and these words are going to be wrong, so I'm sorry, but the becoming the vessel, this is the wrong word, the person capable of receiving Christ.
Yeah.
So that now we become fully human. So before the incarnation, we were not yet, I don't know what the implications are of saying stuff like this. We were not yet fully human. We were human becomings.
Yeah.
Insanely, infinitely valuable because of, like a child in the womb being born. It's like at no point can you say, you're not valuable now. Now you're valuable because you're born. Same thing with like the human person. Before the Christ incarnation, you weren't valuable. No. You were valuable from the day God invited you into creation. Now you become a full human being with Christ in you. Now, what exactly that means, how exactly that works, well, that's the sort of job of the church, right, is to bring Christ to life in all of us, across all the nations, across all time. So that then means, like, if you weren't truly a human before, how free are you? And that's a whole line of thinking. I don't know where it ends, and it's fascinating to me. But now that you are human and Christ is alive in you because he has entered into the human organism across space and time, now we're fully able to be free, meaning able to sort of to drop the addictions, right? To move more fully into being Christ. And you're not going to get it all at once. And I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with all of this, but it's like it's rattling around in my head all the time.
Yeah, preach it. No, I'm right there with you. I mean, it's funny you mentioned that because that's one of the things that really struck me from Jordan Daniel Wood's work. Either the book or I listened to a bunch of his podcasts.
I haven't read his book yet. I want to.
Yeah.
It's expensive though.
Well, yeah, it's tough. I mean, I haven't finished it by any means.
Okay.
But yeah, this idea that we're stuck in time, we're stuck in Chronos, and it's kind of like But if you look at actual, the creation event is at the incarnation, like you just said. Like that's when sort of creation came to be, the in Christ, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so all before, all after, in the terms of our temporal age, is all centered around that. And so then, yeah, like you've said a few times, I think, is it Maximus or another father talks about the becoming human. Like we all kind of take, I feel like, traditional, or like typical Catholic understanding is that, like, we are humans, and
Mm-hmm.
then in Adam we fell, and then et cetera, et cetera. But that takes for granted that we are already humans. But I
Right.
think it's more accurate to say we are
Mm-hmm.
becoming
Right.
human, right?
Right.
We're not there yet. That's actually theosis. Like in God, once
Mm-hmm.
we are God, then we will also be human, right?
Yeah.
So we are, and then and what is the mechanism of that? Well, of course, it's the incarnation. So, like, as we become God, as we become human, like
Yeah.
that, it's the same thing, really,
Mm-hmm.
under created and uncreated aspects, kind of like Bulgakov, right? Like it,
Yeah. Yeah.
created and uncreated Sophia. So anyway, I'm sure I'm slaughtering it myself,
No,
but
I
yeah,
mean,
I'm
hey,
right
let's
there with
just
you.
let's
Like, the
just
idea
go
of we
make a mess together. But yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Gosh. So let's pull that thread that you said earlier about, like, what happens if it is axiomatic, and now what do you do with your life? How do you relate to the rest of the church? I've
yeah.
found, I'll just share one thought, and I want to ask you what you think. I have found, when everyone says, like, oh my gosh, universalism's awful because you're doomed to joy and your choices don't matter. And it's like, if you were to promise me Disneyland, like, no matter what I do, and I mean, gosh, where's that line of thought? First of all, it just seems like such a ridiculous thought. Half the time I think when people say that, and I'm sure someone's going to get really pissed at me for saying this, but I think if you were to say something like that, it means you may not have made enough sense of your suffering, or you may not have suffered enough. Now, that was probably a very harsh thing to say. I feel like I have gone through and endured a lot of, suffering I didn't ask for, want, expect, and I've had to sort of grin and bear it. And then to discover a message like this, because I've struggled with scrupulosity and rigidity. I was washing dishes thinking of this conversation earlier and realized, oh, you know who hates the idea of universalism? Pelagians, right? Which the
Yep.
Holy Fathers warned us against. So, but people with a lack of imagination, or people who also really want the person that they hate to, like, suffer justice for it. But I half wonder, like, a lot of us have a lot of trauma that we deal with at the hands of the abuse of others. And I think that it is not wrong to desire that justice be done, and to recognize that sometimes abusers can become so hardened and calcified that it's going to take something pretty hellific to allow grace to maybe break in, or that the fact that punishment needs to happen, right? I can understand that. It makes sense. And there's a reason why justice is a thing at all. I think, though, if you were to, like, put them up against the wall and actually ask them, like, if you were to fully know everything this person has experienced, and yes, all of them in the whatever relative freedom of their choices turn them into the horrific being that they did become, is eternal conscious torment actually what do you call it? Appropriate response,
Yeah.
for that, or maybe 10,000 years. Okay, we'll give it time, but does it have to be eternal? And if they learn their lesson, and that's kind of the thing that always struck me as funny about the idea of hell. It's like there are so many inconsistent ideas. Like, let's say that you do end up there, right? Here's the problem: the truth will set you free. That's axiomatic. So if you make stupid and bad decisions in your life because you're addicted or something, and then you end up, compulsively throwing yourself into hell under the misguided apprehension that I'm going to safeguard my freedom by throwing myself into this situation, and I'm going to reject God definitively forever because that is how I am free, and being free is the ultimate good for me. And then I get in there for 10,000 years and realize, maybe I was wrong. Well, what have you just done? You discovered the truth. Well, how long is hell going to hold you then? Because truth will set you free.
Right.
And
Right.
I don't know where I was going with that.
Yeah.
Anyhow, I
But
think
yeah,
the point I was trying to say was how, I'll just stop. What do you think?
no, yeah,
Where do you
completely.
go?
Like, I mean, and I think that's just like this the strong biblical argument for the underlying for universalist understanding of freedom, which is just the ancient classical Christian understanding of freedom. It's not the more libertarian modern version, which is just that if you look at all the scripture is filled with the idea that what is sin, what are these evil choices that we make? They're bondage. It's the opposite of freedom, right? And so Christ came to free us, to set us free from the bondage of this of evil, of sin, of death. And so the notion that somehow you could completely in an act of complete freedom utterly reject God forever it's literally a contradiction in terms. So it's a contradiction, at least, of the biblical understanding of what freedom is. Like, that would be a complete act of unfreedom, like non-freedom, if you were to be in such a position that you could be so much enslaved, enthralled to sin and death, that you would think that rejecting your good, the creator of you, would be the right choice. So anyway, how could that be freedom? Like, how? And even if you can grant that someone could do that, let's say somehow you could square that circle, and that's what freedom is, really. But what about your point? And I think that's really the point that's really important, is that, like, what if 10,000 or 10 million years down the road in hell, that soul changes their mind? Like, well, what then, right? Like, and the logic of the gospel. I mean, even to quote Pope Francis, which I think is my own personal theory. I think he's a closet universalism. I'm sure a lot of people think a closet universalist. I mean, he says, no one can be condemned forever. That's not the logic of the gospel. Like, no one could be condemned forever. So, I mean, it's just right there. Right? Like,
there's this quote from St. Teresa of Avila, which I haven't been able to find to substantiate, but Father Richard Rohr found it at one point and likes to quote it. And he said, somebody once asked St. Teresa of Avila, because she would keep having these visits, down there and back, hell and back, right? And then someone would ask her, like, how many, like, gosh, what was it like? How many people are down there? And St. Teresa would go, like, hell exists, right? But there's nobody in it. It's so funny. Don't say it too loud, unfortunately, because men or whatever, or the hierarchy. But so yeah, what do you do, right? So this is going back to the whole doomed by joy thing, right? Which I think is such a I'm not convinced by it, as somebody who is trying to live out this universalist hope every day, and then reinterpret everything in light of what that can mean. So the major thing that I have found has happened is my sense of pressure, of needing to, like, toe specific lines has gone way down. My scrupulosity has gone way down. The sense of rigidity, it's just, all of that has, like, melted away, because just quite simply allowed God to be the good, loving Father that he says he is, and that all things will work for the glory of God. It's like, wow, really? Serious? Okay, let's take you seriously. We'll take you at your word. Like what the Our Father, prayer does, or like what the Our Lady of Fatima, the Jesus prayer, does. It doesn't deny the reality of hell, but we just need to refigure out what it means about what goes there, or what gets burned away, and how it is a restorative thing. So much pressure goes away, and then there's so much now more of there's like obviously there's a much greater hopeful, holistic sense of how I'm trying to now read through scripture, or the visions, mystic visions of things. Because again, you change your ruling vision about what. It's quite possible that some of the gospel writers were more infernalist. That was the ancient view of a lot of stuff. Excuse me. And for Christ to be bringing in this ancient, more universalist take, did they write down exactly how, he meant it, or what they understood he meant, right? I mean, there's a cat among the pigeons question. But some of them are clearly writing down that vision. So if you take that vision, then you go and you look at the magisterium, you look at the catechism, you look at the visions of the mystics, like, okay, if I was universalist, what would all of these mean? First of all, I think you rescue them from a hell of a lot of literalism, which is the fastest way to kill mystical visions, or mystical symbolism is what I should say.
Because Hart is really quick aside. Hart is really good on this too, where just talking about like if you just looking at the Gospels, like what Jesus says about the afterlife is varied. It talks in different metaphors, very metaphorical.
Hmm.
There's also the whole annihilationist interpretation,
Hmm.
and so yeah, it's there's by no means a unified sort of
Hmm.
body
It's
of
like each
text.
one gifts a little bit of something else,
Yeah.
which, and this is probably a whole nother conversation because we're kind of at the top of our hour together. But, you know, what, how to actually think about this idea of the afterlife. Like, what does this actually mean? If, like, there's a penance, if, like Christ says, nobody enters heaven until the last farthing is paid, which means you can pay the last farthing. Or Jordan Daniel Wood loves quoting this part about what is it? The kings of the earth are cast into hell or something. And then he goes and says they are paraded through heaven afterwards, kind of as part of a victory parade. And then he's like,
Mhm.
but hold on, you still have to hold the other one. Nothing imperfect enters heaven, which means if they're parading around inside of heaven or being paraded around, whatever, that means they got cleaned up. So that's a universal. So something was burned away. The dross was burned away. Um, so there's, gosh, I'm not even sure how to wrap up this conversation, but it's like,
Well,
go
can I
ahead.
make one thing that what
Yeah.
you said reminded me of in terms of just the practical day to day?
Yeah. Yeah.
As you mentioned about scrupulosity and the kind of the pressure gets ratcheted down, right? And I think that for me, it's been a very gradual process. But I agree. Like I think in just a verse that comes to mind is just that perfect love casts out fear, right? And I feel like I never
Yeah.
really understood that
Mhm.
like existentially until I became a universalist. And the idea, both personally in my own life, that like I hadn't really realized how much fear, my faith life was kind of this admixture of fear and love, right? But which is really
Yeah.
kind of oil and water. They don't really go together, right?
No,
So,
you end
and
up with this awful codependency instead of freedom.
yeah, that's perfect. I think that's a perfect way to think about it. You're right. Yeah, codependency, exactly right. Yeah. And so just realizing like letting the love actually burn that fear away, and I teach philosophy, one of my classes, we talk about
Oh, wow.
um,
Okay.
Plato and the idea of like, why do we do the right thing, right? And in the Republic, Plato replies to Glaucon. Glaucon claims, oh, the ring of Gyges, the only reason why people do the right thing is because of the consequences, right? For fear of the bad ones or for wanting the good ones, right? And Plato's response ultimately is that like we do good both for because it's valuable for its own sake and for the consequences. Both. But the idea that like doing good is intrinsically valuable, and that's like every Catholic would agree with that. But then if you look at your actual faith life, if you're concerned that like if you don't do the right thing and you don't repent in time and you get hit by a bus or whatever, you're gonna end up in hell. Then how can you not slip into kind of a consequentialist understanding of your
Constant.
faith,
Yeah.
right? So I
Right.
think
Right.
I think for me personally, like universalism has as maybe for the first time truly enabled me to love God, to do good because it's intrinsically valuable, right? It's not because I'm concerned about if I don't do these things, I'm going to end up one of the unlucky ones, right? Like I don't have to worry about that anymore. And then that same idea of love casting out fear applied to like parenting, right? Like which we're very much in the thick of. And like there's so much danger and of fear with your kids, right? Not just physical danger, but like fearing like what if they were to reject the faith? What if they were to go embrace a lifestyle that is just, inimical to one of virtue, whatever, and there's a lot of dangers associated with that fear, like smothering your kids or all the things that parents
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
maybe with good intentions, but they can actually blow up in their faces when it comes to their kids because they're afraid, right? So I feel like in and I feel like I'm so lucky and thankful that I came to this position while my kids are still young,
Yeah.
and so that hopefully I can nip it in the bud and they don't have to go through as much as I did. Not that I had a traumatic childhood or anything, but in terms of like the sort of the perverting effect of infernalist doctrine on a child's faith, and David Bentley Hart's really good on that as well. But just the idea that like as I imperfectly try to form my children, give them the gift of faith that I've been given, it just takes again, it turns down the temperature, it takes off the pressure. It's like I don't have to be afraid of them burning in hell forever. Like and
Right.
and just
Yeah.
saying that to yourself, it's like okay, like we can do this, right? And to be honest, like I do wonder some of my Catholic friends who are infernalists, I guess, because they're just trying to be faithful, nothing at all
Right.
against
It's
them.
normative.
They think this
Yep.
is what, yeah, that there's a lot I think of fear there, and when it comes to their kids, it's like you don't want your kids to end up there, right? And like, and it can be a
Mhm.
very it's just a burden, right? And I'm so thankful we don't have to carry that burden.